The morning sun filtered through the airport windows as Elena moved slowly through the security line. At 67, she had learned to allow extra time for everything. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in her usual neat bun, and comfortable shoes cushioned her steps after decades of standing in front of high school classrooms teaching mathematics. "Next," called the TSA agent, barely looking up as Elena placed her small carry-on bag on the conveyor belt. She slipped off her worn loafers, removed her lightweight jacket, and walked through the scanner without setting off any alarms. Just another invisible older woman making her way through the world. Elena checked her boarding pass again. Flight 1482, Dallas to Washington, D.C., seat 12F. A window seat. She had always preferred watching the clouds drift by, ever since her first flight 35 years ago. Back then, James had held her hand as the plane took off, laughing gently at her white-knuckled grip. "Look at the view, honey," he had said. "It's worth the scary parts." The memory of her late husband brought both warmth and an ache to her chest. 5 years without him, and sometimes it felt like yesterday. Other times, like today, it felt like a lifetime ago. The boarding area was crowded with travelers tapping on phones, children playing handheld games, and business people with their laptops perched precariously on their knees. Elena found a seat near the window overlooking the tarmac and watched the ground crew prepare their aircraft. She pulled out a paperback mystery novel, dog-eared at page 94, but her attention drifted to the workers below, moving with purpose in their bright vests. "Now boarding flight 1482 to Washington, D.C., starting with our priority passengers and those needing special assistance," announced a voice over the intercom. Elena waited patiently for her boarding group. No rush. The plane wouldn't leave without Group 3. When her turn came, she joined the shuffling line down the jetway, nodding politely to the flight attendant who greeted passengers at the door. Elena made her way down the narrow aisle, counting rows until she reached her seat. A young man in a crisp business suit already occupied the aisle seat, his attention fixed on his phone. He shifted his legs slightly to let her pass, but didn't look up or offer to help as she lifted her small bag to the overhead bin. "Excuse me," she said softly, and he moved his legs just enough for her to squeeze by. She settled into her window seat and buckled her seatbelt, tucking her novel into the seat pocket in front of her. The middle seat remained empty as boarding continued, and Elena silently hoped it might stay that way. A small luxury on a full flight. Her hopes were dashed when a harried mother with a toddler in tow paused at their row. 12E, the woman confirmed, glancing at her boarding pass before settling her squirming child into the middle seat. The businessman sighed audibly, and Elena caught his eye, giving him a small smile that seemed to say, "That's life." He didn't return the gesture, instead putting on headphones and turning toward the aisle. "I'm Clara," the young mother said, offering Elena a tired smile as she helped her daughter with her seatbelt. "And this is Lily." "I'm Elena," she replied, her voice warm. "Hello there, Lily. Is this your first airplane ride?" The little girl, no more than 3, nodded solemnly, clutching a well-loved stuffed rabbit. "Bunny's scared," she whispered. "Well, you tell Bunny that I've been on lots of planes and this one looks very safe," Elena said, her teacher's instinct for reassurance kicking in. "And the view from this window is going to be amazing." As the plane filled, flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. Elena watched them with quiet admiration. James had always pointed out good teamwork wherever they went, a habit from his military days. "Look at how they communicate without words," he would say. "That's what keeps people alive in combat, and what makes a good restaurant kitchen run smoothly." The safety demonstration began, and Elena found herself mouthing the words along with the flight attendant. Oxygen masks, life vests, nearest exits. The familiar ritual brought a strange comfort. Little Lily watched with wide eyes, still clutching her rabbit. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Elena felt the familiar flutter in her stomach. Not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that always came with takeoff. The engines roared louder, and she felt the powerful thrust push her gently back into her seat as they accelerated down the runway. Beside her, Lily squealed with delight as the ground fell away beneath them. "Look, Bunny, we're flying," the child exclaimed, and Elena smiled, remembering her own children's first flights. How quickly those years had passed. The plane climbed steadily through scattered clouds, banking gently as it turned northeast toward Washington. The seatbelt sign dinged off and the flight attendants began preparing for beverage service. Outside, the patchwork landscape of Texas stretched into the distance. Farmland, highways, neighborhoods, all looking like a miniature model world from above. Elena's thoughts drifted to the purpose of her journey. Arlington National Cemetery. James's grave. 5 years since the funeral with its rifle salutes and folded flag. 5 years of adjusting to life without the man who had been her companion for over 4 decades. This trip was something she had put off for too long, telling herself she was too busy, that the grandchildren needed her, that the garden couldn't wait. Cookie? Lily's small voice broke through Elena's thoughts as the child offered her a slightly squished chocolate chip cookie from a Ziploc bag. Thank you. That's very kind, Elena said, accepting the treat with appropriate seriousness. Clara gave her an apologetic smile over her daughter's head, but Elena waved it away. My grandchildren are all teenagers now, she explained quietly. I miss these days. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Elena gazed out at the vast sky. James would have known exactly what altitude they were flying at, what kind of cloud formations were below them, probably even the model of engine powering their journey. Colonel James Ramirez had known everything about aircraft. It had been his life's work before cancer took him far too soon. The businessman beside them was now fully engrossed in his laptop, spreadsheets reflecting in his glasses. The flight attendant offered drinks, and Elena requested a ginger ale, helping Lily carefully manage her apple juice without spilling. Life's little moments of connection, she thought. James had always said those were the ones that mattered most. The flight path would take them over Arkansas, Tennessee, and into Virginia. 3 hours in the air, then a taxi to her hotel, and tomorrow morning she would finally visit James. She had his favorite flowers, yellow roses, pressed between the pages of her travel journal to leave at his grave. Not fresh ones, but these had grown in their garden, the one he had helped her plant the spring before his diagnosis. Clouds look like cotton candy, Lily observed, her face pressed against the window. Elena nodded in agreement, seeing the world briefly through a child's wondering eyes. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, pointing out landmarks below and providing their estimated arrival time. Elena checked her watch, a habit James had never broken her of, always knowing the time, always planning ahead. He would have approved of this trip, she thought. He would have said it was about time. As they flew over the Mississippi River, a magnificent winding ribbon cutting through the landscape below, Elena felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Whatever waited for her in Washington, she was ready to face it. After all, she had spent a lifetime as a military wife, facing uncertainties with grace. This journey was just one more mission, one more duty of the heart. Little did she know that Seat 12F was about to become much more than just a spot on a routine flight, and that her name would soon make pilots of the nation's most advanced fighter jet stand at attention. The first sign of trouble came 90 minutes into the flight. Elena noticed it before the announcement, a subtle change in the engine's pitch, a slight wobble that made her tea ripple in its plastic cup. After decades as a military wife, her body was tuned to the language of aircraft. Something wasn't right. Little Lily had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, rabbit clutched tight against her chest. The businessman beside them continued typing, oblivious to the change. But Elena knew. She set down her novel and fixed her eyes on the flight attendants moving through the cabin. Their casual demeanor had shifted. They moved quicker now, exchanging glances, checking seatbelts with heightened attention. The overhead speakers crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice trained to sound normal when things weren't. We're experiencing a minor issue with one of our hydraulic systems. Nothing to be concerned about, but as a precaution, we'll be diverting to make a landing at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. The businessman finally looked up from his laptop, his face tight with annoyance rather than concern. Great, he muttered. There goes my meeting. Clara, the young mother, glanced at Elena with worried eyes. Is it serious? She whispered, one protective arm around her sleeping daughter. No need to worry, Elena reassured her, her voice steady. These precautions are routine. Better to land and check things out than ignore it. She didn't mention that diverting to a military base was far from routine. Commercial flights weren't usually cleared to land at places like Langley unless something significant was happening. The plane banked into a gentle turn, beginning its descent earlier than planned. Elena peered out the window at the patchwork of Virginia countryside below. Clouds had gathered, casting shifting shadows over fields and roads. In the distance, she could make out the coastline, a thin line between land and the vast Atlantic. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, voice pitched low but insistent. "Please stow all items securely. Make sure your seatbelts are fastened tightly across your lap." The businessman reluctantly closed his laptop, sliding it into the bag under the seat in front of him. His fingers drummed impatiently on the armrest. "This is just perfect," he said to no one in particular. "They'll probably bus us to Richmond or something. Hours of delay." Elena didn't respond. Her attention had fixed on something outside the window. Two sleek shapes that had appeared alongside their commercial aircraft, keeping perfect formation about half a mile out. Fighter jets, F-22 Raptors to be precise. The sight of them brought an unexpected lump to her throat. James would have pointed them out with boyish excitement. He'd spent the last decade of his career working on systems for those very aircraft, the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built, he'd told her countless times, pride evident in his voice. Elena could almost hear him now, explaining the capabilities of the twin engines, the thrust vectoring that allowed for incredible maneuverability. The fighters stayed with them, silent guardians escorting the troubled airliner toward safe harbor. Elena wondered if this was standard procedure or if their flight was receiving special attention. Either way, the sight of those aircraft brought both comfort and a bittersweet pang of memory. "Mom, look." Lily had awakened and pressed her face against the window, pointing excitedly at the jets. "Army planes?" "Air Force, sweetie," Elena corrected gently. "Those are F-22 Raptors. The pilots are making sure we get down safely." Clara looked out the window, her face pale. "That seems serious." "Just protocol," Elena assured her, though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. "They're very careful with emergency landings." The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Folks, we're beginning our final approach to Langley Air Force Base. Everything is under control, but please pay close attention to the flight attendants and follow their instructions carefully." Elena watched as the flight attendants demonstrated the brace position. The mood in the cabin had shifted from annoyance to nervous attention. A baby cried somewhere in the back. An older man across the aisle clutched a worn leather Bible. The businessman had stopped complaining and sat rigid in his seat. "It'll be okay," Elena told Clara and Lily, her teacher's voice coming through, the one she'd used to calm classes during storm drills and lockdowns. "I've done emergency landings before. The pilots are well trained for this." What she didn't say was that the emergency landing she'd experienced had been with James, in a small Cessna, when they were both in their 30s. An electrical problem had forced them down in a field in Oklahoma. James had handled it so calmly that she'd actually felt safe the entire time. "Airplanes want to fly," he'd explained afterward, "and they want to land. Our job is just to help them do what they naturally want to do." The plane descended through a layer of clouds, emerging into clearer air. Below, the sprawling complex of Langley Air Force Base came into view. Runways, hangars, administrative buildings. A place Elena had visited many times during James's career, though never under these circumstances. "Look how big," Lily exclaimed, seemingly unbothered by the emergency. Her mother tried to smile, but worry lined her face. The aircraft continued its descent, the runway growing closer. Elena could see emergency vehicles positioned along the tarmac, lights flashing, fire trucks, ambulances, military police. Standard procedure, she knew, but still an unnerving sight. "Cabin crew, seats for landing," the captain announced. The flight attendants moved quickly to their jump seats, strapping in. Elena took a deep breath and folded her hands in her lap, a habit from childhood prayer that had never quite left her. Not that she was particularly religious. James had been the churchgoer in their family. But old patterns emerged in moments of stress. The businessman beside them had gone completely silent. his earlier impatience replaced by tense focus on the seat back in front of him. Clara held Lily close, whispering reassurances. Around them, the cabin was eerily quiet except for the sound of the engines and the occasional creak of the aircraft's body. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk that vibrated through the floor. Elena felt the subtle changes in the plane's attitude as flaps extended, airspeed decreased, nose tilted upward. The runway approached rapidly, a gray strip stretched out before them. The F-22s peeled away, banking sharply as they left their escort duty. Elena watched them go. Those magnificent machines that had been such a part of James's professional life. How strange to see them here now, on this unexpected detour. The airliner's wheels touched down with a screech of rubber against concrete. Reverse thrusters engaged, pushing everyone forward against their seatbelts as the plane decelerated rapidly. The pilot applied heavy braking, and Elena could feel the aircraft shuddering with the effort of shedding speed. They rolled to a stop near the middle of the runway, far from any terminal. Through her window, Elena could see military personnel approaching in vehicles, their movements precise and coordinated. This was not going to be a simple matter of deplaning and continuing their journeys. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at Langley Air Force Base," the captain announced, relief evident in his voice. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further instructions. We'll be towed to a secure area where you'll deplane. Base personnel will guide you from there." Scattered applause broke out, the nervous release of tension that often followed a safe landing after tense moments. Lily clapped along, not fully understanding but caught up in the moment. Her mother finally allowed herself to relax slightly, shoulders dropping from their tense position. "You were right," Clara said to Elena. "Everything's fine." Elena nodded, though she knew their day was far from over. Landing at a military base meant complications, security protocols, transportation arrangements, luggage issues. Her quiet journey to visit James's grave had just become considerably more complex. As the aircraft was towed toward a large hangar, at the edge of the airfield, Elena caught sight of a group of Air Force officers watching their approach. Among the blue uniforms, she noticed one that stood out. A full colonel, back straight, watching the aircraft with particular interest. Little did Elena know that in less than an hour, her name would trigger recognition throughout the base, and those same officers would be standing at attention in her presence. The passenger in seat 12F was about to become much more than just another traveler on a diverted flight. The hangar was cavernous, its high ceiling lost in shadow. Elena stepped carefully down the portable stairs that had been wheeled up to the aircraft, one hand on the railing. Around her, passengers spilled onto the tarmac, blinking in the sudden brightness, clutching purses and jackets in children's hands. Military personnel in blue uniforms directed them toward the open hangar doors with practiced efficiency. "This way, folks," called a young airman, waving them forward. "Please proceed directly to the processing area." Elena walked slowly, her joints stiff after the flight. Lily skipped ahead, seemingly delighted by the adventure, while Clara hurried to keep up with her daughter. The businessman from their row had already disappeared into the crowd, phone pressed to his ear, no doubt rearranging his meeting. The inside of the hangar had been hastily converted into a processing center. Folding tables lined one wall, staffed by Air Force personnel with laptops and clipboards. Rows of plastic chairs filled the center space, already beginning to fill with displaced passengers. At the far end, Elena could see a makeshift refreshment area being set up. Coffee urns, water coolers, boxes of prepackaged snacks. "Please have your identification ready," announced a voice over a portable speaker system. "We'll be processing everyone and arranging alternative transportation as quickly as possible." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Her driver's license was tucked behind a faded photo of James in his dress uniform, taken at his retirement ceremony 12 years ago. His smile looked back at her, confident and proud beneath his officer's cap. She slipped the license out, careful not to disturb the photo. The line moved steadily. Elena found herself behind Clara and Lily, who was now clutching both her rabbit and a juice box provided by a flight attendant. In front of them, an elderly couple leaned on each other, whispering worriedly about missed connections. "Don't worry about your luggage," an Air Force lieutenant was explaining to the group. It will be transferred to whatever transportation we arrange for you. For security reasons, we can't allow civilians to retrieve items from the cargo hold while on base. When Elena reached the front of her line, she approached a table where a young man in uniform sat before a laptop. His name badge read Len Chen. He looked tired but smiled professionally as she stepped up. "ID, please, ma'am," he said, holding out his hand. Elena passed over her driver's license. "Elena Ramirez," she said. "I was in C-12F." The lieutenant nodded, typing her information into his computer. Then he paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked at her license again, then at her face, then back at the screen. "Ramirez," he repeated. "Elena Ramirez." His eyes narrowed slightly. Any relation to Colonel James Ramirez? The question caught her off guard. It had been years since anyone had made the connection. "Yes," she said quietly. "He was my husband. He passed away 5 years ago." Lieutenant Chen's posture changed subtly, straightening in his chair. "One moment, please, ma'am." He stood and stepped away from the table, walking quickly toward a senior officer who stood near the hangar entrance. Elena watched, puzzled, as the lieutenant spoke to the officer, gesturing back toward her. The officer, a gray-haired man with commander's insignia, turned to look in her direction. His eyebrows rose and he nodded sharply before reaching for a radio on his belt. Clara, now seated nearby with Lily, caught Elena's eye. "Everything okay?" she called. Elena shrugged, unsure herself. "I think so," she replied. "Just some confusion with the paperwork, probably." But it wasn't confusion. The commander was now walking directly toward her, his face composed into a carefully neutral expression that couldn't quite hide his interest. Lieutenant Chen trailed behind him like an afterthought. "Mrs. Ramirez?" The commander extended his hand. "I'm Colonel Thomas Wilson, Base Operations Commander. Would you mind coming with me, please? We have a more comfortable waiting area for you." "Is something wrong?" Elena asked, suddenly concerned. Had something happened at home? Was this about James somehow? "Not at all, ma'am," Colonel Wilson assured her. "Just a courtesy. If you'll follow me." Elena hesitated, glancing back at Clara and Lily. The young mother gave her an encouraging smile and a small wave. Elena nodded to her, then turned to follow Colonel Wilson, who was already walking toward a side door of the hangar. Lieutenant Chen hurried ahead to open it for them. "Your husband was Colonel James Ramirez, Systems Development Specialist for the F-22 program?" Colonel Wilson asked as they walked across the tarmac toward a low building marked Base Operations. "Yes," Elena confirmed, increasingly bewildered. "But how did you—" "Your name flagged in our system," he explained. Colonel Ramirez's contributions to this base and to Air Combat Command were significant. There was something in his voice. Respect, certainly, but also something else. Reverence, perhaps. They entered the building through a security door where Colonel Wilson swiped an access card. Inside was a stark contrast to the makeshift arrangements in the hangar. Polished floors, proper furniture, walls lined with photographs of aircraft and distinguished officers. Air conditioning hummed quietly, a respite from the Virginia summer heat. Wilson led her to a small conference room with a window overlooking the runway. "Please have a seat. Can I get you coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be nice," Elena said, still trying to understand what was happening. She sat in one of the padded chairs, setting her purse beside her. Through the window she could see their commercial aircraft, now surrounded by maintenance vehicles. In the distance, a pair of F-22s roared down the runway, climbing steeply into the blue sky. Colonel Wilson stepped out, returning moments later with a proper ceramic mug of coffee. "Cream and sugar are on the table," he said, setting it before her. "Mrs. Ramirez, I apologize for the mysterious treatment. It's just that your husband's name carries significant weight here at Langley." Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I don't understand. James retired 12 years ago. He's been gone for 5. Wilson nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Yes, but his work lives on." He gestured toward the window. "Those F-22s that just took off? They're running systems your husband helped design. The targeting algorithms, the threat assessment protocols, pilots still call them Ramirez systems." Elena stared at him, speechless. James had never spoken much about his work, bound by security clearances and his own natural modesty. She knew he'd been involved in systems development, but he'd always downplayed his contributions. "Just one of the team," he'd say whenever she'd asked. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Wilson called, "Enter," and the door opened to reveal a woman in a flight suit, her short hair still bearing the imprint of a helmet. She stepped inside and came to attention. "Captain Brooks reporting as requested, sir." "At ease, Captain," Wilson said. "This is Mrs. Elena Ramirez, Colonel James Ramirez's widow." The pilot's eyes widened slightly, and she turned to Elena with newfound interest. "Ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly respectful. "It's an honor. I fly Raptor 051. Your husband's Talon system saved my life over the Persian Gulf last year." Elena blinked, surprised. "Talon system? Tactical Air Limitation and Offensive Network," Captain Brooks explained. "It's what we call the Integrated Threat Response System Colonel Ramirez developed. It identifies and prioritizes threats faster than any previous system. When my wingman's aircraft was disabled and 3 hostile aircraft converged, Talon guided me through an engagement sequence that let me protect both of us until support arrived." A flush of pride warmed Elena's cheeks. This was James's legacy, not just notes in a classified file or a name on a plaque, but real lives saved. The door opened again and 2 more pilots entered, followed by another officer Elena couldn't identify. All of them came to attention when they saw her, as if she were the commanding officer in the room. "Mrs. Ramirez," said one of the new pilots, a tall man with a weathered face. "Major Davis, I flew with your husband during testing phases of the F-22. His work changed everything about how we engage in air combat." The room was becoming crowded now, and Elena felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. For 5 years she'd been just a retired teacher, a widow, a grandmother who volunteered at the library twice a week. Now she was being treated like visiting royalty. Colonel Wilson seemed to sense her discomfort. "Gentlemen, Captain, give Mrs. Ramirez some space, please. She's had quite a day already." As the officers stepped back, Elena found her voice again. "I had no idea," she said simply. "James never talked much about his work. I knew it was important, but this—" She gestured at the assembled pilots. "Your husband's modesty was legendary," Wilson said with a small smile. "But make no mistake, Mrs. Ramirez, the men and women who fly those aircraft—" He nodded toward the window where another F-22 was taxiing. "Owe their lives to his innovations. When your name came up in our passenger manifest, every pilot on this base wanted to meet you." Elena looked from face to face, seeing in each the respect they'd held for a man they'd either known personally or knew through the systems that protected them in the skies. In all her years as a military wife, she'd never fully understood the reach of James's work until this moment. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for remembering him." Outside the window, the F-22 lifted off the runway, afterburners glowing as it climbed toward the clouds. A fitting memorial to the man who had helped make it one of the most formidable aircraft in history. And Elena, no longer just a passenger in seat 12F, felt closer to James than she had in years. The afternoon sun slanted through the conference room windows, painting golden rectangles on the polished table. Elena sat with her hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, her third since arriving at the base operations building. Around her, officers came and went, each stopping to introduce themselves, each with a story about James or the systems he'd helped create. "Your husband's work on the threat assessment protocols completely changed our training program," explained a gray-haired flight instructor, leaning forward in his chair. "We used to lose pilots in training because the old systems couldn't process information fast enough. Since implementing the Ramirez protocols, we haven't lost a single trainee to system failure." Elena nodded, still trying to absorb it all. The technical details went over her head, but the impact was clear enough. James had saved lives, not just in combat zones, but here at home, in training facilities and test flights. Colonel Wilson returned, accompanied by a man in civilian clothes carrying a laptop. "Mrs. Ramirez, this is Dr. Peterson from the Air Combat Systems Division. He worked directly with your husband on the Talon project." Dr. Peterson smiled. "He talked about you all the time. Showed us pictures of your garden. Said you could grow roses that would make anyone believe in miracles." The unexpected personal detail caught Elena off guard. Tears pricked at her eyes and she blinked them away. "The yellow ones were his favorite," she said softly. The scientist nodded, then turned his laptop toward her. "I thought you might like to see something. This is footage from a test flight last month, using the latest version of your husband's targeting system." The screen showed a cockpit view from an F-22, heads-up display overlaying the sky with data. Numbers and symbols flickered at the edges, altitude, speed coordinates, while in the center, colored boxes highlighted other aircraft, identifying them with codes Elena didn't understand. The pilot is facing a simulated attack from multiple directions, Dr. Peterson explained. Watch how the system prioritizes threats and suggests evasive maneuvers. On screen, red boxes suddenly appeared, surrounding several of the aircraft. The display flashed new information, and a suggested flight path appeared, a curving line through the sky that would take the F-22 safely through the gauntlet of threats. The entire assessment and response recommendation took 0.8 seconds, Dr. Peterson said, his voice tinged with pride. Before your husband's algorithms, the fastest response time was over 3 seconds. In aerial combat, that difference is... He paused, searching for words. Life or death, Elena finished for him. Exactly. He closed the laptop. We've continued refining his work, of course. But the core principles, the truly innovative parts, those are all James. We still call it the Ramirez system in his honor. Elena felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in James's achievements, sadness that he wasn't here to see his legacy, and a lingering confusion about why he had never fully explained the importance of his work to her. As if reading her thoughts, Dr. Peterson said, he was always so modest about his contributions. Some of us used to tease him about it. You're saving pilots' lives, James, we'd say. You're allowed to brag a little. But he'd just shake his head and say the real heroes were the men and women who flew the aircraft. Colonel Wilson, who had been standing quietly nearby, cleared his throat. Speaking of which, Mrs. Ramirez, there are several pilots who've specifically requested to meet you. They're waiting in the briefing room next door if you're up for more visitors. Elena hesitated. The attention was flattering but overwhelming. She had come to Washington for a quiet visit to Arlington, not to be treated like a celebrity. Yet she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her chest each time someone shared a story about James. It was like getting small pieces of him back, filling in gaps she hadn't known existed. Yes, she decided, I'd like that. Wilson escorted her to an adjoining room, larger than the conference room with rows of chairs facing a projection screen. About a dozen men and women in flight suits stood as she entered, coming to attention as if a high-ranking officer had walked in. The sight made Elena's breath catch. This wasn't protocol or courtesy. This was genuine respect. A woman with captain's bars stepped forward. Mrs. Ramirez, I'm Captain Reynolds. Squadron 27. She paused, seeming to gather herself. 2 years ago, my wingman and I were on patrol over international waters when we encountered unidentified aircraft that refused to respond to communications. Your husband's threat assessment system identified hostile intent before they even changed course. We had countermeasures deployed before they fired. Every pilot in this room has a similar story. One by one, they introduced themselves, lieutenants, captains, majors, each with a story about how the Ramirez system had given them the edge in a dangerous situation. Elena listened, nodding, sometimes asking questions when she could find her voice. These weren't abstract tales of technology. They were stories of people coming home to families because James had devoted years to solving problems most people never even knew existed. A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Lieutenant Chen, the young officer who had first recognized her name, stepped in. Excuse me, Colonel, but we've made arrangements for Mrs. Ramirez's continued travel to Washington, and the base commander would like to speak with her before she departs. Wilson checked his watch. Of course. Thank you, Lieutenant. He turned to Elena. If you'll come with me, Mrs. Ramirez. The base commander doesn't often come down personally to meet visitors. As they walked through the corridors of the operations building, Elena's mind was spinning with everything she'd learned. James had been more than just a systems engineer. He had been a guardian angel of sorts for these pilots, his work continuing to protect them long after he was gone. They entered a large office with windows overlooking the flight line. Behind a desk stood an older man with general stars on his shoulders, the first general Elena had met today. He looked up as they entered, set down his pen, and came around the desk to greet her. Mrs. Ramirez, he said, extending his hand. General Howard, I served with your husband during Desert Storm, long before he revolutionized our aircraft systems. He was a fine officer then, and an even finer engineer later. Elena shook his hand, feeling somewhat dazed by the continued attention. Thank you, General. I'm learning so much about James today that I never knew. The General gestured to a seating area by the window. Please sit. I understand you're on your way to Arlington? Yes, Elena confirmed, sinking gratefully into a leather armchair. The long day was beginning to take its toll. It's the 5th anniversary of his passing next week. General Howard nodded solemnly. A great loss to the Air Force family. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Mrs. Ramirez, I understand your flight won't be continuing to Washington. The aircraft requires more extensive repairs than initially thought. Yes. Lieutenant Chen mentioned arrangements were being made, Elena said, wondering if she would be put on a bus or perhaps a later commercial flight. Indeed. The General's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. We've taken the liberty of arranging military transport for you directly to Andrews Air Force Base. From there, we'll provide a car to take you wherever you need to go in Washington. Elena blinked in surprise. That's very kind, but surely that's not necessary. I can take whatever transportation you're arranging for the other passengers. General Howard shook his head. Mrs. Ramirez, your husband's work has saved countless lives and aircraft worth billions of dollars. The least we can do is provide you with appropriate transportation. He leaned forward slightly. Additionally, if you're agreeable, we would be honored to arrange a small ceremony at Arlington during your visit. Nothing elaborate, just a few pilots who would like to pay their respects alongside you. Elena felt tears threatening again. I don't know what to say. Say yes, the General replied simply. Allow us to honor not just your husband's contributions to the Air Force, but your support that made his work possible. Military families serve too, Mrs. Ramirez. James knew that better than most. Through the window, Elena could see an aircraft unlike the others, smaller, sleeker, with distinctive Air Force markings. A crew was preparing it for flight, and she realized with a start that this was to be her transportation to Washington. Yes, she said finally. Thank you. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Elena Ramirez no longer just a passenger in seat 12F, but the keeper of a legacy she was only beginning to understand, prepared to continue her journey to Arlington, accompanied by the respect and gratitude of an entire base of men and women whose lives had been touched by her husband's quiet genius. Morning sunlight spilled across Arlington National Cemetery, catching on rows of white headstones that stretched over the rolling hills like a solemn, silent formation. Elena stood by the car that had brought her here, a military sedan with an Air Force driver who now waited respectfully by the vehicle. She wore a simple blue dress, James's favorite color, and carried a small bouquet of yellow roses from their garden at home, carefully preserved between the pages of her travel journal. Are you ready, ma'am? Asked Captain Reynolds, who had volunteered to escort her from Andrews Air Force Base this morning. Elena nodded, taking a deep breath. The events of yesterday still felt dreamlike. The emergency landing, the revelation of James's importance to the Air Force, the flight on a military transport plane where she'd been treated with the courtesy usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. She had spent the night in visitor quarters at Andrews instead of her planned hotel, surrounded by photographs of aircraft and military memorabilia that reminded her of the home she and James had made together during his service years. Now, as she walked beside Captain Reynolds along the paved path winding through Arlington, reality began to settle in. She was here finally, 5 years after the funeral, to visit her husband's grave properly. Colonel Ramirez is in Section 60, the captain said softly. It's not far. They walked in companionable silence. Around them, the cemetery was peaceful. A few other visitors moved quietly among the graves, some leaving flowers, others simply standing in remembrance. A groundskeeper tended to the immaculate lawn in the distance, and far off, Elena could hear the faint sound of a bugle practicing. As they crested a small rise, Elena stopped in surprise. Ahead, gathered around a white headstone, stood a group of people in Air Force dress uniforms, about a dozen officers arranged in a loose semicircle. General Howard was among them, as were several of the pilots she had met at Langley. Colonel Wilson stood slightly apart, speaking quietly with a chaplain. "What is this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you some of us wanted to pay our respects alongside you," Captain Reynolds replied. "I hope it's not too much. Everyone here has a personal connection to your husband's work." Elena blinked back tears. "No, it's..." It's perfect. As they approached, the officers came to attention. General Howard stepped forward. Mrs. Ramirez, thank you for allowing us to join you today. Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The general guided her gently to the front of the gathering, where James's headstone stood in the morning light. The simple white marble was engraved with his name, rank, dates of birth and death, and his service details. Below, the words beloved husband, father, and guardian were carved, the last word a reference to his call sign during his flying days. The chaplain stepped forward and spoke briefly, a simple prayer about service and sacrifice, about lives that touch others in ways both seen and unseen. Elena barely heard the words. Her eyes were fixed on the headstone, on the name of the man who had been her partner for 42 years. When the chaplain finished, there was a moment of silence. Then General Howard spoke. Colonel James Ramirez was known to most of us as an exceptional systems engineer, the architect of technologies that protect our pilots every day. But he was first and foremost a husband, a father, and an officer who understood that everything we do is in service to others. The general looked at Elena. Mrs. Ramirez, would you like to say anything? Elena hadn't prepared anything formal. She had expected this visit to be private, just her and her memories of James. But standing here, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her husband's work, words came naturally. James never talked much about his work at home, she began softly. He would say it was classified or complicated, or just not as interesting as what was happening in our garden or with our grandchildren. She smiled faintly at the memory. I knew he was doing important things, but until yesterday, I never understood just how many lives he had touched. She looked around at the assembled officers, meeting their eyes one by one. Thank you for showing me this part of my husband's life, for letting me see the difference he made. James would have been embarrassed by all this attention. He was never comfortable in the spotlight, but he would have been deeply honored to know his work continues to protect you. Elena stepped forward and knelt beside the headstone, gently placing the yellow roses at its base. She rested her hand on the cool marble for a moment, whispering words too quiet for others to hear. As she rose, Captain Reynolds stepped forward. Mrs. Ramirez, with your permission, we have something for you. The captain nodded to one of the other officers who came forward carrying a wooden case. He presented it to Elena with formal precision. This is an F-22 model signed by every active Raptor pilot who has flown with the Ramirez systems, Captain Reynolds explained. And this, she indicated a folded flag in a triangular case that another officer brought forward, flew over Langley Air Force Base yesterday, in honor of Colonel Ramirez. Elena accepted the gifts, touched beyond words by the gesture. Thank you, she managed. I'll treasure these. General Howard cleared his throat. There's one more thing, Mrs. Ramirez. 2 days ago, the Secretary of the Air Force signed an order. Beginning next month, the Tactical Air Combat Systems Training Facility at Edwards Air Force Base will be renamed the Colonel James Ramirez Center for Aviation Excellence. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathered officers. Elena felt her knees weaken slightly, and Captain Reynolds steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. James would have been... She paused, searching for the right word. Humbled, she decided finally. And so am I. As the formal part of the gathering concluded, the officers came forward one by one to shake Elena's hand and share brief words. Memories of James, gratitude for his work, quiet promises to honor his legacy. Some simply nodded respectfully, understanding that words were sometimes inadequate. Captain Brooks, the young female pilot Elena had met at Langley, was the last to approach. Mrs. Ramirez, she said quietly, I've been selected as one of the test pilots for the next generation of the Talon system. Your husband's work will continue to evolve and protect pilots for decades to come. Elena smiled through her tears. He would have liked that very much, especially knowing a talented young woman like you is helping to carry it forward. As the officers began to disperse, General Howard approached one final time. Mrs. Ramirez, the Air Force would be honored to host you anytime you wish to visit any of our facilities, where your husband's systems are in use. You will always be welcome among us. Thank you, General. I might take you up on that someday. Elena looked back at James's headstone, now adorned with yellow roses. I think it would help me feel close to him, seeing his work continuing. The general nodded and moved away, leaving Elena alone for a final private moment. She stood before the grave, the morning sun warm on her face, the weight of the model aircraft and folded flag in her arms a tangible reminder of the legacy she carried now. "Oh, James," she whispered, "you never told me just how much you did, how many lives you touched. I wish I had known. I wish I could have told you how proud I am." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees overhead, and somewhere in the distance an aircraft passed, its engine sound distinct from commercial planes. An F-22 perhaps slicing through the clear blue sky above Arlington. Elena smiled and looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun. 5 years ago, she had stood in this same spot, newly widowed and uncertain of the future. Today she stood straighter, carrying not just grief but also pride and a newfound connection to the world James had helped shape. As she walked back toward the waiting car, Captain Reynolds fell into step beside her. "Where to now, Mrs. Ramirez?" Elena considered the question. Her original plan had been simple: visit the grave, then return home to her quiet life. But something had changed. The passenger from seat 12F had embarked on an unexpected journey, one that she now realized was just beginning. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to see some of these systems in action." General Howard mentioned a simulator at Andrews. Captain Reynolds smiled. "Yes, ma'am. I can arrange that immediately." Elena nodded, her decision made. James had spent his life protecting others through his work. Perhaps the best way to honor him was to fully understand that legacy, to witness firsthand the difference he had made. As the car pulled away from Arlington, Elena looked back one last time at the sea of white headstones. Among them was James, her husband, partner, and as she now understood more than ever, a quiet hero whose brilliance continued to guard those who soared through dangerous skies, his systems a shield protecting them long after he was gone. She was no longer just Elena Ramirez, widow and retired teacher. She was the keeper of a legacy that made F-22 pilots stand at attention, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt herself standing a little taller too.